This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I caught the headline recently. Ben Bernanke responding to the criticism of ultra-low interest rates and stating quite clearly that he did not throw seniors under the bus, so to speak. He's right. He didn't throw them under the bus. He threw them under the bus, backed the bus up, ran over them 3 or 4 or 5, 10 times, and then put skid marks across their face. So he's right. He did not just throw them under the bus. Just caught my eye recently. Just a thought. This episode today has absolutely nothing to do with Ben Bernanke. My commentary on Ben Bernanke will not help you make $1. It won't help me make $1. If you think I'm angry about Ben Bernanke, you would be sadly mistaken. I do think it's interesting, though, if you go back in time and look at Bernanke's quotes, the things he was saying in 05, 06, 07, literally had absolutely no clue. And now all these years later, pontificates like he has a clue. I tell you, the central bankers, the leaders in government, they always have an answer. They're never wrong about anything. They just say the next statement for the next day, and they hope no one keeps track of the prior statement. But again, none of this stuff is relevant to you making money. I think it's relevant to good governance. It's relevant to good society. I think we all can't abdicate our responsibilities to try to talk about doing the right thing. So that's why I make a little bit of criticism, commentary about Mr. Bernanke right now. My guest today is Gary Dayton, performance psychologist for traders. Gary has put together something he calls a Mindfulness-Acceptance-Commitment, MAC, approach to peak performance. It's a model of human behavior based on cutting-edge psychological research. That's Gary's background. I love these types of episodes. I love just getting into the mind. There's so many people out there, they think, give me the latest and greatest software. Give me the latest and greatest system. Just tell me what to do. Don't take all these psychologists, peak performance. I don't want to listen to any of this stuff. This isn't relevant to me. And those are the people that fall down. And not only bruise their knee, they get a cut on their knee, they get a cut on their leg, and they get a cut on their forehead, and they bleed out. They bleed out cash because they don't think about the internal. They don't think about the self. They don't think about the mind, the behavior, all those many biases that we operate under. They miss the boat. They don't think. They don't concentrate. They don't dig in. What drives us human beings, and how can we work around all this behavior that we've developed over the millennia that sometimes helps us in big ways. But when it comes to the markets, I'm telling you, our internal, that internal thinking we have, that internal discretion, that internal instinct, it doesn't usually help us. Gary and I go into those areas today. We dig in and hopefully shed a little light, a little more light on the psychological side of good trading. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Gary Dayton. Listen, let me jump right in. One of the reasons that I'm in Asia is because a few years ago on my podcast, I was living in San Diego, and I started talking about my new yoga class that I started taking in April or May of 2012. And I started talking about yoga in between financial and psychological based podcasts. And a banker in Tokyo reached out to me and he said, hey, why don't you come speak for this event? And that snowballed into, anyways, me spending a lot of time in Asia. So I thought it was really interesting when I started to look at your work, the whole idea of mindfulness. Mm-hmm. Wow, that's right in the headspace of a still relatively new yogi aficionado. So really interesting. Let me ask the question I want to ask though out of the gate, because you talk about it in your book. You're a trained clinical psychologist, and you're at an event, and you could describe this, but you're at an event and basically somebody was suicidal, just deeply depressed, and a technique was used on this person that you had not seen before. Why don't you set that up and explain that story?
And you're right. Mindfulness, we often think about it, at least here in the West, as coming from the Buddhist tradition. But in actuality, it comes out of the Indian, the East Asian Indian yogic tradition. The first written record of mindfulness was recorded by a yogi named Patanjali. And he goes through, called the Yoga Sutras, and he goes through exactly how to conduct mindfulness. The Buddha was a yogi as well before he became a Buddha. So this was around 2000, maybe 1998 or 1999. And I was at a psychology conference, and you're correct, I was a clinical psychologist to begin with, trained as that, and treated people with depression and anxiety and schizophrenia and addictions before I became more of a trading psychologist. So I was at this conference for psychologists, and I went in to a presentation conducted by a fellow by the name of Stephen Hayes, who also is a psychologist. He did something that, for me, was mind-blowing. He showed a videotape of somebody who was obviously depressed, obviously had suicidal thoughts, wanted to harm themselves because the future looked so bleak for them. And within a single session, this psychologist turned this person around, and then he reported and showed a little video clip of, might have been a month or so later, of this person who was cheerful, buoyant, very upbeat, totally had changed from a pessimistic to an optimistic outlook. And I didn't really understand it at the time. It seemed very foreign to me. I didn't quite get what he was doing. And at the time, there was not much written about this approach. Sort of an interesting story. Hayes himself, was the subject of severe panic attacks, and he tried all kinds of different psychological approaches. Regular behavioral therapy. He's a behavioral therapist, as I was. Psychoanalytic therapy, where you'd lie down on the couch for the next 6 or 7 years and tell your story, and other kinds of therapies, but nothing seemed to work. And he came up with this approach that he calls, sort of inartfully, acceptance and commitment therapy, or acceptance and commitment training. And it's based on a mindfulness model. And he found out that it worked pretty well. And what he did then was he shelved it. He put it up on the shelf for about 10 years and said, well, if this really works, then there has to be basic science behind it. And he went ahead and started to look at the basic science of why things like this approach worked so well. That's called relational frame theory, which is a very deep, scientific, and quite frankly, rather esoteric. Even when I read it, it's very hard for me to read the material because it has its own language and jargon. But he went ahead and looked at the basic science, figured that out, and then has come back and looked at the actual therapeutic techniques, the technology, if you will, the method and the approach of what we call ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. And it's now blossomed into something over the last 15 years or so where I can't keep up with the literature on it.
Let me interject. So the example though, and I'm gonna broaden this out in a moment. I just thought it was such a unique example that brought me into the story of where you were going, and I wanted to get the audience going there too. But if we just, before I broaden this out to mindfulness and talk about your definition of it, so to speak, what were you seeing though? What were you witnessing with this suicidal patient, this deeply depressed person? And what were you witnessing that was causing you as a trained clinical psychologist to say, wow, he's doing something? I mean, what was the something that you were seeing really quick that you didn't understand, but you probably knew immediately that it was effective, and you're thinking, well, and you knew kind of what he was doing, but just explain a little bit more there, what you were seeing at that moment with that particular example, because it really struck you.
Oh yeah, it did, very much so. Usually when we look at suicidal ideation, we will look to try to change person's thoughts, try to reframe them and dispute them. But he wasn't doing any of that. He was actually accepting their thoughts, saying, oh yeah, you have these suicidal thoughts. Not paying an enormous amount of attention to them, but asking her, the patient happened to be a woman, asking her what was important to her, and how did she see herself doing these important things? What was of value to her? What mattered to her? And how did he see herself? How did she see herself acting, even though she might have these thoughts of suicidal ideation? I thought, my gosh, how do you do that? We're in the business of trying to change thoughts. He doesn't care about her thoughts. He's more concerned about how she's acting and almost carrying these thoughts with her as she's acting out her daily activities.
So just that moment, that trigger for you, and let's broaden this out for a moment and talk about the phrase, the term, the definition of mindfulness. Because the first time I heard it, I mean, I'm sure I heard it mentioned somewhere, but in a conversation where someone is using it with me and forcing me to think about this word was yoga. And so why don't you talk about it the first time you have to, you're on the elevator or the cocktail party, whatever, and you need to talk about being mindful. Explain mindfulness.
Well, mindfulness, as we view it, is, if you want a definition, it is seeing events as they unfold, either outside of you or inside of you, your internal events or the environment, in a non-judgmental, moment-to-moment way. All we're doing is paying attention to the present moment. What we have a strong tendency to do is to go back into the past, and our mind gets stimulated by something in the current environment, and that brings us into a past memory. And we drag that into the present moment and color the present moment with that. Or we might go into the future and think about, what do I want out of this situation? What do I want to try to achieve? And so we drag the future into the present. We are very rarely in the present moment for what it is. We're frequent flyers, if you will, in our mind, into the past and into the present, and coloring our experience of reality with our past and with our future projections.
Am I going to cause you, I hope I cause you to smile when I say this, because I thoroughly enjoy him. He's not alive anymore, but your work and the mindfulness, to me, it brings to mind a lot of the videos and books that I've read that involve Alan Watts.
Oh, yeah, sure. He was the first one to bring the idea of Zen Buddhism and some of the Asian thought into the West. He's a great guy. I love his work.
Yeah, just fabulous. And I think this mindfulness, and it's all about, as you say, it's not about changing the thoughts or the feelings that we have. It's noticing them. And I love the analogy, the metaphor kind of you say is like, you want to sidestep these unwanted thoughts and feelings, not control them. And you said it's a mental aikido. Talk about that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, bringing in now Stephen Hayes's ACT, the Acceptance and Commitment, It's accepting those thoughts as they are and understanding what's important to you and acting or behaving or taking action in the direction of what really matters to you and not getting caught up in your past or what you want out of the future, but just seeing the present moment for what it is, seeing what's happening, if it's in the markets or if it's in a conversation with somebody that you're having, whatever it is, you see it for what it is, and you pursue what matters to you. Simple as that. Though very, very difficult to do.
I like to, the mindfulness is about, it's a heightened clarity. This is just taking right from you, a heightened clarity. You're focusing on the here and now, and things are temporary. They're not permanent states. And that temporary one, that's really tough for us, because when that, we start to move this into the trading conversation, when that situation looks bad, that situation looks bleak, and even if you're losing a small amount of money, we create these mental images in our minds that just can be almost as bad as a lion eating us alive. We put so much into it, but it's temporary often, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And that's exactly right. What we call fuse with the content of our mind. We bring the past or the future into the present moment, and we view it as if it is going to actually play out as reality. In other words, we view our thoughts and our emotions too as accurate reflections of reality, when in fact most of the time they are not. If you think about it, it's 9:00 p.m. in your world. What you felt and thought this morning compared to what you are thinking and feeling now are most likely very different. We have somebody estimated, I don't know if this is accurate or not, but it seems pretty close. We have 60,000 thoughts a day. Well, we at least have thousands and thousands of thoughts a day. And they come and go on their own recognizance. I've been doing psychology in the field of psychology for about 20 years now. And I've never met anyone who has been able to consistently control either their thoughts or their feelings, consistently over a long period of time. It's just not possible. So mindfulness now helps us deal with this ability of our mind, but also it's like a double-edged sword. It's great in a lot of ways, but it creates problems, especially when we're looking at risk and uncertainty. And so mindfulness does allow us to step back from our thoughts and step back from our feelings and be that kind of a keto master, to be able to say, okay, I don't have to pay attention to this thought. What's important to me, especially in a trade, is to let the trade play out on its own process. And that's what I'm going to do.
How did you make the marriage? What was the trigger in your life or your career? You said clinical psychologist, and then right. you saw an opening, you saw an opportunity, you saw a passion, a switch, a change in your life where you said, hey, I want to go down this path of money, markets, trading, investing. What was the nexus? What was the trigger? What did it to you?
Oh, that's a good question. It's a funny question. I had been involved in a relationship that went sour, and I was actually quite devastated by it. Believe it or not, I got a booklet in the mail, and I read it, or actually it sat on my bedstand for about a month or so, and I finally read it, and I thought, oh, this is pretty cool. You could make money so easily, I thought. And I ordered one of his programs, his courses, and it was in a book form. And when I got it, I read it, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. I stayed up all night reading it through a couple of times, and then started to try to apply it, and quickly realized it ain't as easy as it looks. As I got deeper into trading myself, and I was trading at that time commodities, I began to realize there's a big mental component to this, a huge mental component, huge psychological component. And I guess it was my frustration at being unable to trade well and unable to understand how to do it that sparked the interest of combining both trading and trading psychology in my work.
Here's where I'd like to slide into. As I'm reading your book, I'm thinking to myself, and I've thought this I would call them your peers, Van Tharp, Brett Steenbarger, Mark Douglas, guys that have written some really interesting work talking about psychology in the field of trading. But I always start to think about the styles of trading, because I sometimes feel like that's the part that gets left out. And for me, I start to think about, for example, in my world a little bit, a particular style of trading that I've written some books about is very systematic. It's generally applied very systematically. So the notion of somebody in front of their screen, almost kind of I'm not saying you've positioned things like this, but I'm saying the notion of people in front of their screen in a cockpit-like environment, making either minute by minute or during the day decisions. There's a lot of trading strategies that don't do that. Now, I think a lot of the things that you talk about are built in to the longer term systematic strategies. But I think it's really interesting when I think about all of the wonderful work out there in the field of trading psychology. I sometimes feel like that the methods, the strategies themselves, they're not all created equal, are they?
No, they're not. Although, when we're thinking about trading, it doesn't matter. I believe this. I think that it doesn't really matter whether you're a long-term trader using a system, or a defined method, or you're a discretionary trader. It's still about process and following a trading process. Lots of times traders get in trouble by focusing on their results, whether they're a systems trader long-term or you're trading in and out of the noise, of each hour of the day. Traders are more focused on whether the trade is going to be a winner or a loser. And that's the wrong mindset to have. We know that from research. We know it from practical experience. We know it from the experience of other people other traders that I've worked with. When we focus on results, no matter whether we're trading minute by minute or month by month, it's just not the right focus. We're operating in a probabilistic field. And Mark Douglas was the one who brought this out to traders, I think. He said there was a paradox here. Any given trade, we never know whether the outcome is going to be a winner or a loser, because every trade is based on a probabilistic curve. In other words, if you have a 65% win rate, then 35% of the time, that trade's not going to produce a win. Yet, if we do this over a large number of trades, the edge that we have, our trading edge, will prevail. So there's a paradox. You don't want to focus on the individual trade. You want to focus on the larger portfolio of trades that you make over time. And unfortunately, many traders, and I think this probably does get more we see it more in day traders. They focus on the individual outcomes of trades rather than their trades over time.
I think it might be useful for the audience, and you do a great job in your work on this, bringing forward many of the lessons, and I've had him on my podcast, but many of the lessons and instruction, research the results from Daniel Kahneman. And I wonder if you might go through and define a few of these heuristics and biases for me. And I scribbled out a few of them here, and I would love for you just to kind of go through them, and I can just kind of give you one and let you kind of go with it, and I'll give you a second one. But just even starting off with something like the endowment effect. I would love for you just to kind of go through a couple of these for the audience in this nice long form podcast and let you teach a little.
Sure, why not? Well, heuristics. Let's break that term down. That comes out of behavioral finance, and it's Dan Kahneman's work. He's a Nobel laureate, and his partner, Amos Tversky, who unfortunately died in his 50s prematurely. But their work is just, these guys are my psychology heroes, these two. they've done such good work. Heuristics is just a fancy way of saying a mental shortcut. And we're primed that way. We are looking to be efficient and not expend a lot of mental energy. And so we will take shortcuts, and they work pretty well most of the time. I'll give you an everyday example since we have time here, and then I'll relate it back to trading, and we'll talk a little bit about the endowment effect. If we're, let's say we're in an unfamiliar town, we're driving along and it's 6 o'clock at night and we're hungry. So we need to stop and go someplace to eat, find a restaurant to eat. We see a restaurant, we pull in, there's a few cars in the parking lot, the building looks attractive, and we see a couple of people coming out and they're smiling. So we say to ourselves, this must be a good spot. We're going to eat here. Notice how we made this decision. We made it essentially on the appearance of cars and building and people coming out with smiles. We didn't go and interview those patrons and say, was this a good restaurant? What did you enjoy? What did you not enjoy? And make the evaluation from there. We didn't go in and ask for a sample of the food to taste it to see if it was to our liking. We substituted an easy question, does this place look good, for a harder question, do they serve good food? Okay, that's a heuristic. Substituting, it meant taking that mental shortcut and substituting a shorter approach to a more difficult question.
That's not necessarily bad for that particular example. That's how I judge street food.
Yeah, exactly. And it works well in our day-to-day lives. But what Kahneman and Tversky found is that when we are in the environment of risk and uncertainty, which is trading, that gets us into trouble. Let's take, for example, a bull flag. A trader sees a chart pattern. It could be a bullish engulfing pattern, pick your pattern. But we'll use a bull flag since everybody will most likely know what that entails. So a trader sees a bull flag and says, that looks like that's a bullish setup. I'm going to go long here. All right. Well, that's just using appearance, and it's asking the simple question, does this chart pattern match my model of a bull flag? And the answer, of course, is yes. But what it doesn't ask is, what's the next likely direction of the market? For that, you have to do a much more in-depth analysis. You've got to look at higher time frames. You've got to look at the trend, all kinds of other things. That bull flag, for example, might be occurring at monthly resistance or yearly resistance. It could be the beginning of distribution, not the continuation of an uptrend. So that's why heuristics don't work very well in trading. Now, the endowment effect is essentially looking at something that we already own. We buy a stock, and I use in the book an example that actually comes out of real life. A doctor had a position, a good-sized position in Apple Computer, or Apple Inc., I should say. He bought it, and he had doubled his position size, and it was getting to be parabolic. And this guy was a savvy chart reader. He understood the charts. It was getting to be parabolic, looking like it was coming into what we would call climactic action or an exhaustion up move. And instead of taking some of his trade off, he held on to it because in his mind, it had a higher value. And that's the hallmark of the endowment effect. We own something, but we won't sell it out until we get what we believe it's worth. And part of his problem was that he loved Apple products. He loved the iPhone. He loved the iPad. He knew every nuance of it, had every latest model, and was just enthralled with it. And that kind of kept him in this idea that the stock had much higher value than what it was trading at. And of course, a year or two later, he was back down to about break even, maybe a little bit higher than that, but had lost a substantial amount of paper profits simply because he believed the price was going to be higher.
Let me, as you bring up the notion of price, and we're talking heuristics, And I'm just relaying it as an example as I think through what you're talking about and thinking of the mindfulness. There's many traders out there that would believe and say, price is my heuristic. Because I'm agnostic. I don't know which way the market's going to go. And so I'm just going to use that simple heuristic of price action. And whichever way the price is going is the way I'm going. I don't have a setup, or I don't even have a notion of where things are going to go. I don't even have the probabilities figured out necessarily. But higher highs beget higher highs, and lower lows beget lower lows. And I'm going to follow that price action. When you hear that kind of an analysis, what's your feedback on something like that?
Two things, really. What's the point at which you don't want to hold that stock any longer? In other words, what's the point at which it's showing you that it's not making higher highs on each move up? So it might be a higher low, or a lower high, I'm sorry. It might be a lower high and then a lower low that will get you out of that trade, but you've got to have some point that you exit. And that needs to be thought through. And the second thing is that you tell me you don't really have much sense about probabilities. That is a big no-no in my mind. You want to make sure that every trade setup that you have has an associated set of probabilities that go with it. Otherwise, you're going to be trading. Well, you're going to be trading in blind spots all the time.
Well, let me rephrase that. So As I lay that scenario out, I am assuming risk management. I'm assuming, hey, we're not going to overbet. We're going to keep our bet size right. There's going to be an exit strategy, but no probabilistic thinking in the sense that there's no way to predict the next move. That there's no way to, like, for example, there would have been I don't really think that there was any great avalanche of experts that have been aggregated into a list to say that we all knew that oil was going to collapse over 50% in the last 6 months. That was just my perspective from there. It would have been hard from a probabilistic standpoint, I think, for many people to say, oh, we know oil is going to collapse 50%. I think most people probably didn't have probabilities that showed that.
Right. I'm sure that they didn't. Although, frankly, in the oil market, you could see that there was weakness building in the market, at least from the perspective that I trade, which is from a price and volume approach using the Wyckoff method. We were talking about this in one of the programs that I run for traders. We were talking about this in, I think it was early July or mid-July of last year, that oil was weak and we were looking to take short positions in it. So that was readable. Obviously, we didn't know it was going to run 50%. No one would be able to know that. So you can follow price action and volume down as a monitoring tool for your trade. But there still has to be at some point where you view the market as no longer moving in the direction that you originally envisioned.
Gotta have an exit. I think we're in a complete agreement there.
Yeah, you really do have to have an exit strategy. That's got to be part of your process of trading. Yeah. If you don't have an exit strategy, you're going to be subject to heuristics all over the place.
You talked about something, you used a phrase early on. You said fusion. Mm-hmm. There's also the flip side, diffusion. And I thought, and I'd love for you to kind of explain that yin and yang there, but I thought one of the interesting things in your work was the notion that we often think that everything is a problem to solve. We have to just keep solving problems. And again, from a mindfulness perspective, we don't necessarily need to solve every problem, do we?
No, and in fact, we don't want to when it's a problem that goes inside of us between the ears, so to speak. We do see everything as a problem, and there's a reason, I think, for that. We've grown up since children to view what goes on within our mind, the thoughts that we have and the feelings that we have, as real and as helpful, in fact. If we look at the information superhighway and we look at sending people to the moon on rocket ships and our smartphone applications and computer technology, all that comes from problem solving. And it's terrific. It's what distinguishes the human being from all the other animals in the world. When we apply it, however, to us, for example, I might say to myself, oh, Michael is better in XYZ than I am. Well, then that becomes a problem, right? And how do I solve that problem? Well, in other words, let me try to make this more clear.
I like that one. I kind of knew where you were going. I relate to that. I hear craziness like that all the time from people. And when I'm just an average guy like everybody else. I know people that are less achievement or more achievement or more skill or less skill. But I tell you what, when somebody makes a direct comparison to me about anything, I just kind of look at them and I say, gosh, I wish you knew better than not to do that.
Yes, exactly right. But that comparison is a problem-solving approach. When we problem solve, we compare and contrast, right? We evaluate those comparisons. We look for the best solution. We work through problems, keep and discard aspects of those comparisons. We do that all the time. But when we do it with ourselves, it becomes very problematic, because now I compare myself to you and I find myself falling short, even though you would say to me, if you knew what was going on in my head, right, that you shouldn't be doing that because you do that with everybody else. I mean, that's kind of the big myth, or the big thing that's never discussed. The big elephant in the room is that everybody does this, no matter who we are. And when I do that with you, I find myself falling short. And now, what do I do with that? Now I feel bad. Now I start having thoughts that run something like this. Well, Gary, you're not as good as Michael. So, gee, Gary, you really aren't that good in what you thought you were, are you? And it can go all the way down to the extreme of, gee, Gary, you're just not a very good person at all, are you? And you can make yourself, I mean, that's crazy making. You want to get yourself crazy and nuts, that's the way to do it. But that's exactly what we do all the time. Mindfulness allows us to step back from that stuff and see that for exactly what it is. Just thoughts and feelings that we have that are automatically generated by the experiences of being a human being.
I love the way you expressed this. You gave an example, a contrast. One can say, I am sad. Or one can say, I'm having a feeling of sadness. Two very different things. Explain.
Yes. When we say I'm sad, we're connecting to the sadness and we're defining ourselves. I am sad. I equal sad. That's what we call fusion. It's like two hot pieces of plastic coming together and fusing together. We are so married to our thoughts and feelings that we sometimes can't see our way clear out of that forest. When we step back, however, and mindfully say to ourselves, oh yeah, I'm having the feeling that I'm sad, that suddenly opens things up. It gives us distance on our feeling. I'm having the feeling that I'm sad is not the same as I am sad. We are not defining ourselves, or I am not defining myself as sad. I'm simply saying I'm defining myself as having a self that's a little bit different than that, not a little bit, but significantly different than that, standing here on the side, noticing that I'm having a feeling that I'm sad. Very, very different. That's what we call diffusion.
So for those people in the audience that are sitting out there right now and they're thinking, because somehow or another they've missed the depth of this conversation, and they're saying, what does this have to do with trading? And I'm thinking to myself, well, you could say to yourself, I am losing. Or you could say to yourself, I have a losing trade.
That's right. And the actions that you're going to take are going to be completely different. If you're saying to yourself, I am having a losing trade, you're not defining yourself by the loss, and it gives you more flexibility, more agility mentally to be able to act to cut that losing trade and get out of it. If you're having a losing trade and you are saying, I am having a loss, and I am, and you're fused to this trade is going to turn out to be a loser, and that's going to be really bad for me, then you are subject to a couple of things happen. Actually, your attention goes from monitoring the trade to your internal state. And it may not seem it. It may be hard to parse this out, but what's really happening is that your focus and your attention is on the discomfort you feel. And it's not comfortable to have a losing trade. We all know that, to have a trade that's not performing the way you wanted it to be performing. You feel the tension. I know that when I feel tension, my elbows go up into my ears. Other people will feel tension across the chest. They might feel sweaty palms or a dry mouth or a queasy stomach. All of that is natural that we feel when we get into the fight-flight kind of response, which is triggered by a threat, which is that loss that we're experiencing. So our focus goes inside on the bodily sensations, and it goes inside to our thoughts, and it goes inside to our emotions, which could be ranging anywhere from apprehension to, depending on how severe this loss is, could be terrifying. Regardless, our attention is internal, and we eventually cut that trade and exit that trade, but we're doing it for a purpose. Not for the trade, but for the purpose of solving our internal state. And what do we feel when we get rid of a loss? We may feel the pain of the loss, but we also feel relief from all that tension. And we feel, oh, thank God I'm out of that trade. That's why when our attention shifts internally and we lose sight of the trade, we get distracted by our internal state, then we're not trading well. Because we're trading off of our emotions, and we're really trading, what I say, in the service of our emotions and not in the service of our trade.
One of the ones that I love, that I see all the time, it's amazing to me, I guess, unless you meet people that have made billions of dollars, hundreds of millions, unless you meet people that have had that level of success, and unless you understand that they put their pants on the same way, too many people that are inexperienced in trading, investing in the markets, I think when we're just talking about the losing side, it's the winning side too. I am a big winner, or I have had a big winning trade.
Right. I've had a big winner. I've had a big winning trade, or I've had 3 winners in a row. Aren't I great? And then we'll look at the performance after that. Part of this is regression to the mean, of course, but there's also something we call moral licensing. It kind of gives us the right to throw out our rules and our procedures and our process and sort of act with abandon. In other words, we have a couple of good winning trades in a row. We feel great. We feel like we're on top of the world. And then we start doing foolish things because we feel so good that we let our guard down and we let our process and our procedures go, and we start taking marginal trades. We don't set our stops correctly, or we give them more room because, boy, the last trade was so good, this will work out too. Things like that will happen for us.
I have one last question, Gary, and I won't keep you. Great insights. There's actually, and I want you to explain this from top to bottom in as much time as you want to take. There's actually a change in the gene expression after mindfulness. Yes?
Oh, yeah. Mindfulness, let's back up a second here. Mindfulness, comes out of a 2,500 plus year history. But we're just now starting to look at this more carefully. Richie Davidson from the University of Wisconsin probably gets the most credit for doing this. He was a lone voice decades ago about emotions in psychology, and then he met the Dalai Lama, and the two of them talked. The Dalai Lama agreed to allow scientific inquiry to be applied to his form of mindfulness, and that's what started all of this research that we see, and now it's coming out into the public, and it's become a hot topic, this idea of mindfulness. But yeah, one of the things that Davidson's research lab has shown is that we actually can turn on the DNA for stress or not stress through mindfulness. Maybe even more important than that is that they just found that telomeres, which is it's a little piece of our DNA. Every time a cell divides or subdivides, basic biology, our cells subdivide, and we don't have the same cells today as we did last year. Most of them have been replaced, or many of them have been replaced. Now, I'm not a biologist, so that's in general. But what happens as the cell subdivides, that telomere shortens, and scientists have been able to associate the shortening of telomeres with our life expectancy. So the shorter that the telomeres become, the less able the cell is to subdivide, and eventually it dies off, and that's our aging process. Well, mindfulness now is showing that it prevents some of that telomere shortening. So potentially it's a very good news for us in terms of our physical health, not just our mental health. But look, if you take mindfulness and you look at the research, it doesn't matter what, I probably shouldn't say this quite so broadly, but I will anyway. It almost doesn't matter what action we're talking about in terms of trading. Mindfulness is going to have a positive benefit to it. We know, for example, that loss aversion, the tendency to cut our winning trade short, the tendency to be conservative with winning trades, and to be risky with losing trades, in other words, holding on losing trades in the hopes that they come back to break even or small profit, and other aspects of loss aversion. That's tied to a part in the brain called the amygdala, which is our fear center, or as some scientists call it, our panic button. The brain pushes the amygdala pushes the panic button and sends a whole cascade of hormones and proteins throughout our body to gear us up for threats and to cause us to take action. Well, mindfulness attenuates the actual size of the amygdala. In other words, it reduces the gray matter in the connections in the amygdala. So it dampens the loss aversion effect that pretty much every trader feels at some point or another. It helps us with our executive functions, our ability to problem solve and to internally regulate our emotions through the what's called the prefrontal cortex. It also helps us to be more sensitive to bodily sensations. So we'll be able to recognize when the fear response starts to set in. It helps us in mental flexibility and switching strategies. So when a market begins to change from an uptrend to a downtrend, mindfulness is going to help us be able to detect that earlier. As I say, I can't think of one thing in trading that mindfulness doesn't affect in a positive way. And in my humble judgment, mindfulness is the most important mental skill a trader could develop.
You've got a lot of different techniques in your work. People should definitely take a good read. I will offer from my own personal experience, my path to mindfulness has come through yoga. I know some people go through meditation, maybe some of the other techniques in your work. But the stress, for me personally, the stress reducing component of yoga, the physical practice, I'm addicted to. I mean, I have to have it. I know there's probably some guys out there that are thinking, yeah, yoga. Yeah, I give you, it's kind of a California hippie term. It's not exactly great. I will grant you that. But the physical act of yoga and the way you feel after, I can just say it's something to where just you're just not, I don't want to say drunk, but it's it's a euphoria that is so peaceful and so like, wow, I want to have that. I want to have more of that. I want to have a lot of that. I don't want to stop having that. And I don't yet know any other avenue. And like I said, your work, you talk about a lot of different ways to get there. But for the physical aspect of it, for me, I don't know any other way to get there. And plus, for you males out there that happen to like women, yoga's not a bad place to be. That's my thought on that. So.
That's a good point. Actually, I came to mindfulness through yoga as well. And you're absolutely right. Yoga is, it lights up our endorphins, our painkillers, and does make us give us that euphoric feeling. And you're absolutely right about yoga and helping you have a calm mind. Yoga was originally created not so much for doing postures or asanas as we think about it in the West, but really to calm the mind. So it has both a euphoric aspect to it and a mind calming aspect to it. And it's great. I practice yoga every morning, and it's a great way to stay fit and flexible, especially as you age. And it's just 30 minutes a day for 2 months, 8 weeks, showed structural changes in the brain that were positive in stress reduction and are positive in trading. So it doesn't take a long period of time to see good positive results. And as one yoga practitioner I know, who is a very great guy, he's up in Maine, and he does yoga with lobstermen, the big burly guys coming off the lobster boats every morning. So if they can do it, traders can do it as well.
Where can we send everybody? Where can we send them, Gary? Where's your best? Look, the book is on Amazon. We can find that everywhere. Trade Mindfully. That's out now, right?
That's right. It just came out in December.
Okay. And where is the best web location that people can go to check you out?
It's called tradingpsychologyedge.com. Okay. That's my website and blogspot.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. Quite the education. I hope people enjoy it, and I think it's an interesting topic for people. I'm sure some people will listen to us, and it might go over their head because they're not yet open to the idea of frankly some self-analysis. But I think for those people, there's probably going to be elements of our conversation where there's going to be many light bulb moments where people just go, "Oh wow, that's a different way to look at it." And I think that's probably your hope, my hope, right?
Absolutely. I hope people do have a moment or two of an aha moment or two. If you do, check it out a little bit further. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do it with my work. Just work on the mental side. I think it's so important in trading.
Gary, thank you. I appreciate it.
Michael, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.